We're live.
All right, we're going. Well, that's a pretty good place to start, really, because I just did want to ask you at the beginning, how you first got interested in Joseph R. Brown. When did he come to your attention, and why was he so interesting to you?
You answer.
Well, doing a book about him, of course, nobody had tried it before because it seemed to be very difficult, if not impossible, because there wasn't a lot to be found about him. So after 20 years, we finally found out enough to do this one.
Yeah.
And what was, there must have been, obviously, some historical record. You heard of him.
Yeah.
What was it about him that you said, I'd like to know a little bit more?
Well, I think when we moved to Stillwater here was when we really got interested, because this is probably known as his first town site. He called it Dakota. He was always going to have Dakota. This would have been the state of Dakota if he'd had his way. But, well, knowing about that, well, what else do we know? And so we got into this. And archival material is very slim, so it's a matter of finding everything. You can talk to that. He's the researcher.
Okay.
Yeah, if to find out something about the pre-territorial history of Joseph R. Brown, you're essentially going to have to look in Wisconsin stuff, which is one reason why a lot of people didn't dig it out. Because, of course, you tend to go to the Minnesota Historical Society, and there's not much there.
And so you started to, you found a few documents and information about him, and what compelled you to keep going, to go beyond, most people would have given up. There's not much there, What compelled you to, keep going?
It actually led to quite a few vacation trips out to Washington, D.C., to Maryland and Pennsylvania, where he grew up. And so that, of course, was a little draw, for me at least.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
And we ran across early on a little advertisement in the Lancaster, Pennsylvania newspaper about a runaway apprentice to a newspaper man, and he had gone off, disappeared. He was not to be trusted in anything he may say to save himself from difficulties, and the reward was
$50, I believe.
Oh, not that much.
$10.
At least $10 reward, which would be, of course, be a lot of money in 1820. And by the description, they were wondering why they wanted him back, and I guess we found out.
Because
he was pretty good, yeah.
Wasn't he? He was the apprentice, but wasn't that another word for indentured servant? Or
yeah.
Well, essentially, his father would have taken a certain sum from the fellow to whom he apprenticed him, and in return, the newspaper man was going to teach him how to set type, which is a very valuable bit of knowledge in those days, and would keep him working there and feed him for a period of years. And released, he'd be set free to go off and prey on the world as a journeyman printer.
Which he did later. He did, but as a printer.
And he did set type for Minnesota's first newspaper in 1849, 1850, and charged the editor for so doing.
Mm-hmm.
No doubt, but he decided he wasn't going to be a printer's apprentice in Pennsylvania forever, so how did he get out of that, and what did he do?
Well, he simply ran away with, I believe, some subscription money that had come into his possession at some point, and joined the Army. He was 15 years old, so they took him on as a well, they called him a private, I believe, but he was actually what they all call him, the drummer boy. He was a musician and got shipped out here to Fort Snelling, where he stayed for several years. He was in the Army for 8 years. And when he got out, he was down at Fort Armstrong, Illinois, and went into the fur trade business right away. By that time, he was a gunnery sergeant, I believe. So he'd risen some in the ranks. But he was still only 23.
Yeah, when he re-enlisted, of course, that would be at 1825. Well, you were supposed to be 21 years old to join the Army, unless you had the permission of your father. But then he'd been in 5 years, and he didn't manage to make the minimum yet.
Yeah, he was still underage.
And he must have had some exposure to the indigenous people before, while he was in the...
Oh, yes, certainly he did. He was, of course, at Fort Snelling, they were surrounded by the Dakota villages, and so he knew very well, the people that lived around there. He knew the fur traders that lived around there. By 1827, he was going by himself up to Lac qui Parle. I don't know who he knew up there exactly, but that was where the Renvilles hung out. He was also married to a part Indian woman by then, so, or 28, yeah, by then, 25 he got married, so. So he was very walking around with the Indians at that place and further west too. He actually, when he joined the fur trade, he was actually dealing with the Saukee Meskwaki down in Illinois and Iowa. So he must have had a good translator at that point, I would think, because I don't know how many languages he spoke, but when he came to Minnesota, he began dealing with the Ojibwe up at Snake River and up above Taylor's Falls. So I think he must have spoke quite a few Indian languages, or knew enough to get along with them,
Yeah, in Dakota, he was, we've seen several letters that he wrote in the Dakota language, or wrote them and received them.
Yeah.
And it was said by his daughter that Dakota was spoken pretty much in the Brown household. Mrs. Brown was more comfortable speaking Dakota or perhaps French.
Or French, yeah.
And of course, the children were all native speakers.
And his familiarity then, and familiarity both in his experience and familial, I guess, must have perhaps been a motivator, but certainly a primary attribute that got him into the fur trade.
Oh, yes, definitely. The other thing would be that the Mississippi River was a dividing line at this time. That is, it was all Indian country. To the west of that, you could not set foot in that country if you were not a licensed fur trader or one of his employees, or you had to otherwise be with the military. So if you want to stay and you're married to a girl there, you might want to look into getting to be a licensed fur trader, and of course he did.
And that was, they were the first people aside from the soldiers who had, and can you speak about the relationship between the fur traders and the Indian population?
Well, that varies a lot. Among the fur traders, you'd have a few people whose parents were part Indian or Indian, and they were in the fur trade. You had some people who were fairly well educated and fell into the fur trade. About as many different types of people and types of relationships as you'd find in other business or any other village.
Yeah.
The odd thing about Brown is, I suppose, is that through his whole political career, I can't imagine anybody who even mentioned that his wife was an Indian woman, part Indian woman, who spoke Dakota around the house.
Yeah. And he was active for how long? How long of a period was fur trading his primary, if not exclusive, occupation?
Well, I would say that he never gave it up, not as a primary occupation, but from the time he got out of the Army up through the 30s, that was his business. He started into lumbering a little bit once the treaties and the 37 treaties were signed. He started into farming a little bit. But until there was a territory of Minnesota, that was pretty much what he did. Once there was a territory, he was off and running as a politician. But that didn't mean he didn't have all kinds of people out there trading for him, and he did. He had 2 brothers who were active in the trade. His sons were active in the trade. His father-in-law was active, and he was a full-blood Wahpeton. But, but they were all very active in fur trading for many years. And of course, he got to be Indian agent after a bit, and in 1857. After that, he was very much involved. After the Indian uprising, he was very much involved because he was the man who was trying to save the Indians who hadn't been involved in the uprising. And he was also the man who was chasing with Sibley the Indians that had been involved, trying to bring them to justice, as they would say today. But so he never got out of that era, I don't think. He was always very, very involved with the Indian communities, although it might have changed communities. He was probably with the Minnewakanton first, but then moved on to the Sisseton Wahpeton because they were his wife's relatives at that point. So.
Well, you mentioned it was, 1828, and he was down in Illinois originally, but then by the late 1830s, he was back in Minnesota.
1835, he was back here?
He was back in 1830, actually. He was hired by the American Fur Company and sent up to, well, he worked for Alexis Bay, who was out of Mendota, but he was actually sent up on the St. Croix River at that point. And later on moved to Hastings. There wasn't no town then, of course, but the area of Hastings, which was called Oliver's Grove in those days. And eventually, when Henry Sibley came to run the Mendota trade, Joe worked for him out at Lake Traverse. So he was all over the place in Minnesota after 1830.
And didn't he establish, or he set up shop, as it were, at what's now called Great Cloud Island?
Yeah. That was probably his longest home site, because when the treaties of 1837 were ratified in Congress, that made all the Indians were to move out of what's now Washington County, basically. Washington County's Ramsey and up to the Mississippi. So he staked a claim there on the island and got a steamboat landing going, and got himself made Justice of the Peace. He was the law north of Prairie du Chien, actually. That's all there was. And worked in, he got a county established. This is where politics comes back. He went to the legislature in Wisconsin and demanded for the citizenry here of this, which was still Wisconsin here, that they would have a new political government. They would have judges. They would have courts. People didn't have to go to Prairie du Chien for everything. And So you have to say, I guess that was the thing that I even call a turning point in his life. When he had, you know, hey, we can do things in politics. And I think he really, after that, was a very political animal. He involved with territorial. He was in the Wisconsin territorial legislature and also in the Minnesota territorial legislature.
I was going to ask about that because is it called the Stillwater Convention? You talk a little bit about that history. Was Wisconsin a territory and wanted to be a state, and he played a role in that?
Well, this is a little gimmick, if you will, is the basis of that, and it's apparently dreamed up by a attorney who had been a Wisconsin newspaper editor. We think that Mr. Brown was in on it from the beginning, but basically the idea was going to be that when Wisconsin became a state, you'd have a little leftover bit of old Wisconsin territory that wasn't in the new boundaries. Well, therefore, the idea was, theoretically, that was still Wisconsin territory, and since the governor of the old territory had resigned, he had another office. Then John Catlin, who was a secretary, was now the governor, and someone talked John into coming to Stillwater and declaring that he was going to hold an election for delegate. Now, before that, there was the Stillwater Convention, and this was got up to just send a petition in and say it's a terrible thing, we're left here without any law and order and what's going to happen. But Henry Sibley got up and said that he would be willing to go to Washington and lobby for this entirely at his expense. And Mr. Brown and some others got up and said, "Spot on, Henry. We'll have a vote and we'll authorize you to go off and be our representative." Well, when Catlin came out just a few weeks later and said, now we're going to have an election for delegate, a lot of people thought it would be pretty shabby that if you voted for somebody else besides Henry Sibley, since he had gone out of sheer goodwill and had gone out to Washington and offered to avoid, not call, passing the hat, to take a collection to get him sent out there. He's a wonderful man. Mm-hmm. And some people said that there might be a little element of prearrangement in this whole thing, but it's not provable. As a footnote, there are a lot of things about Mr. Brown's activities that are not provable. There's something like some of investigations that are going on in Washington today. There's something there, but you can't prove it.
Yeah. But that is true of history in general, anyway.
So it is, especially.
It's all either an opinion or just a pretty good theory, but pretty soon you find another little piece of paper that says something different, and then you say, oh boy, I got to come up with a new theory.
That's when you have to come up with a new theory, by the way, when your old theory is proven to be faulty in some respects. That's what makes it fun, you know.
Oh, it is. It is fun. And that's where this book ends, right there. What he was just talking about, that election is where we ended it up, because Henry Sibley did get a territory authorized, and so it did become Minnesota. And then you're off and running with a whole new set of characters, and so that's book 2.
Very good.
But just realizing that this whole big thing here took place in the early years, the 30 years that the man was here. And now we got another 20 years, and it really is very, very complex after that.
With how much source material?
Yeah. Well, there is more source material for after the Indian uprising in 1862. The reason being, before that, Brown's house was burned. Everything he owned was gone. He had no records left, and maybe one or two books that maybe have been with some fur post or something somewhere have been recovered. A few letters were found blowing around on the prairie, but basically you don't have anything at all of his. That's what made this one very difficult. You had to find it in someone else's letters, letters that had received, government records and so forth.
You guys obviously had a lot of perseverance.
Well, also we're not working with a grant. I mean, once you're working with a grant, you have to accomplish. We just float along.
Well, that's true. If you're a genuine academic and you're doing a genuine history, then you have some pressure on you to actually churn something out after a number of years. The committee on your PhD is going to be inquiring as to when are you going to produce something.
Yeah.
But we don't have that.
Well, we have a little pressure. They keep inquiring when we're going to produce something, but we're working on it.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Can we go back a little bit about, it's called the Stillwater Convention. From what I understand, Mr. Brown played a role in the founding of this town, but it had a different name originally.
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the history of the town that we're in right now?
Well, this was in relation to him being a lobbyist for the settlers. The settlers are at this point in 1839 being kicked out of the Fort Snelling Reserve. This is where the origins of St. Paul are. They had to move that far away. And Mr. Brown also had property over there, which he at that time probably thought would make a nice city, but the Army thought different about that. Also made a nice grog shop, and that might have been a little too much of an attraction for the men at the fort. So he went to see if he could rectify this. He said, this is part of Wisconsin territory, and there's no reason why there shouldn't be civil law here instead of the Army. You see, how can they just overtake civil jurisdiction? But the jurisdiction was way down in Prairie du Chien. So at that point, he did some lobbying and got this county erected. And it was the county of St. Croix in those days. It's on both sides of the river, and it was really huge, went all the way to the Canadian border. However, it did have a county seat, and it turned out to be his town site of Dakota, which is what we're sitting on right now. So that part worked out. He still lived on Great Cloud Island, but he imported quite a few relatives to also populate his city of Dakota. This didn't work out in the long run. The county government sort of fell apart, but at least it was the first government here north of Prairie du Chien, basically. So there's a first right there. There's a good reason to pursue Mr. Brown. Is how did he do these things? He also got himself elected to the legislature, so from there on in, he could handle this stuff as a real representative.
It was a very interesting local government, by the way, that Joseph R. Brown was the justice of the peace. He was the clerk of the county board, register of deeds, the representative in the legislature, contractor to build the courthouse, owner of the town site of the...
assistant marshal, too.
Oh, assistant,
and in the militia.
Assistant United States Marshal and chairman of the local Democratic Party Committee.
Yeah. And temperance.
Yeah.
Temperance Union, yes. Yeah. So he was really a very big wheel, and the more you dig into this, you think, wow, was nobody else interested, or were they just letting him do it? And I think that was probably what it was. He knew what to do, and fine, let Brown do it.
Well, that seems to be one of the things that comes across in your book is, just how remarkably talented, had so many skills.
Your hands in the shot when you do that.
Oh. And, you know, you said, you know, did people just let him do it? You know, he seemed to want to be influential.
Well, in a lot of cases in the legislature, if somebody wanted a bill drawn up, and you can't imagine that a lot of these people would have a lot of experience in writing bills and getting them to come out right, and there was nobody there except Mr. Brown who was going to do it, so a lot of bills are in his handwriting that he didn't introduce. And when it came to reapportioning the legislature, well, this was always a big problem, and of course there's going to be a lot of battles. But apparently they pretty much left it to Mr. Brown to handle writing up the reapportionment, despite the fact that he was a well-known partisan of the Democratic Party. But the Republicans apparently disregarded that as about as fair as they could get, or quite fair at all, actually.
And did, so Wisconsin gets established in 1848, and then, as you said, you know, this was originally Wisconsin territory. How did the history progress that got from 1848 to 1858 when Minnesota was a state? What were the actions, you know, the changes in political designation that eventually resulted in Minnesota becoming a state?
Well, the original territory of Minnesota, of course, you'd cut the piece off that was part of Wisconsin. Well, that doesn't make much of a state. That just goes to the Mississippi River. So you tack on everything all the way to the Missouri River, and there's, you might as well, because there's nobody out there except the Indians anyhow, so there's, but you have to do something with it. And once you do that, it turned out that the Whigs, that's the opposition party, the Democrats, had won, and therefore they sent in Alexander Ramsey and a few other people that they appointed who were members of the Whig Party. They're well connected. Now, the next step, of course, would be that everything beyond the Mississippi River is Indian country, and there's no settlers that can come in there, and this is not going to create a very thriving territory. So the next thing to do was have an Indian treaty and move the Indians off a little bit. That happened, and then they went along perfectly happy for a number of years, the federal government paying for the expenses of the territory and everybody's salaries and building the roads, building the public buildings in the Capitol. And apparently everybody was happy with that until 1857, when I discovered somebody in the Appropriations Committee talked to the delegate from Minnesota. You'd have one representative, we called him a delegate, and he had been pretty successful in getting appropriations from Minnesota. But the chairman of the Appropriations Committee told him that, Henry, we're going to cut you off. So he decided, well, we'll have to become a state then.
This was Henry Rice,
yeah,
not Henry Sibley. Yeah.
And a lot of territories became states when they had just barely enough population to qualify, but it was thought that Minnesota could easily have 3 representatives in the House of Representatives. Turned out there were actually 2, but everybody thought there would be enough for 3.
And Joe Brown was, you know, involved in making the transition from territory to state?
Well, he was at the Constitutional Convention. He wrote the whole part of the Constitution that has to do with the legislature.
At least it's in his handwriting.
You know, well, actually, they named a committee to come up with the part of the Constitution to do with the legislature. That was on a Monday. And Joe turned up on Tuesday with the whole thing already written up. So either he's remarkably quick at getting this thing through the committee, or it was in his pocket beforehand, and it pretty much went through the way that he'd written it, and a lot of it is still there. Mm-hmm. Hasn't changed.
So anybody reading the Minnesota Constitution is reading at least, you know, part of it, or words?
The part of it has to deal with the legislature. The original part of it, that's in his language, and mm-hmm. It says he wanted it. The qualifications for a legislator, I think, have been changed a little bit to require you to be a citizen. And you don't have to be white or male, but outside of that, originally the qualification to be a legislator would be you would be a qualified voter, which in those days meant you would file your declaration of intent to become a citizen someday.
And you had to have lived.
You had to have lived in the territory long enough to find a place to hang your hat. And
2 weeks, I think, or something.
Yeah, you'd say you'd been there for a very brief period of time. Yeah. In other words, anybody who wanted to come and live here could vote and could get elected to represent his fellow citizens.
And yet, it seems like he preferred working a little bit behind the scenes, because it seems like if he had wanted to, he could have, you know, gotten himself to be one of the representatives, and yet he turned a different direction.
Well, he said that he was going to run for Congress, or somebody said that he was going to run for Congress, and it was pretty well put about by one of his colleagues at the newspaper. But he was also awaiting appointment as Sioux Indian agent. Well, you can't be both. You can't be a federal officer and be elected to Congress. So it came down to the point where he got the appointment as Indian agent, and apparently he decided that he would take it. Being Indian agent pays a small salary, but it's could be made fairly lucrative. At least some people discovered that that was the case. Whereas being a congressman in those days, you'd be limited to taking a per diem, that is your expenses per day, plus your transportation. And this is not going to be a paying proposition if you're going to live in Washington. So he actually got at the election for United States Senator, which was done in those days by a vote of both houses of the new state legislature. He got 8 votes. And everybody had said, a lot of people had said that he'd be very likely to get elected to Congress if he had chosen to run.
Well, one thing that might very well have changed his mind is the territory filled up so quickly, nobody could believe, you know, steamboats for 400 and 500 people on board were coming up the river and getting off in St. Paul. And it went from territory, from an early 6,000, 7,000, 8,000 people around, you know, to 55,000.
Generously speaking, by the way.
Yeah, within a few years, 60,000 people are here, and they're all getting into this new Indian land that has been ceded. And I think Joe really felt he could do more because there had been some Indian clashes at that point, the Ink-Paduta affair and other things. He might have felt he could very well do something with the Indians on the reservation and keep the settlers and the Indians away from each other, so to speak. Apparently he actually did pretty well at that. The Indian War broke out after he had left, and after the government had left nobody up here to enforce anything. So there was probably some good reasons behind why that broke out, but he was already gone by then and on to other projects.
Yeah, maybe we could, as long as we're on the subject of the, how they figured out what to do with the, settlers and Indians, go back to 1851 and the treaty at the Traverse des Sioux and the, what was it called, the
Treaty at Mendot.
Traders paper that he was involved with. Again, maybe, while he was doing all these other things, he was actively involved there.
Well, he was involved, and so were several of the other major traders. Henry Sibley, Martin McLeod, and others wrote up this paper. Now, what this was supposed to indicate was how much money everyone had involved in the fur trade. And you must know that the fur trade operated at those times just like Visa operates today. Nobody ever exchanged any money. The Indian would come in and say, I need a new gun. He'd get a gun, and they would write it up. He owes us so much. And then every year they'd tack on interest because he never paid it, or maybe he got killed. And so the gun is gone, the Indian's gone, and there's no money. So they'd keep track of all this stuff. Very meticulous books. You should see what they've got out in Washington when they come up with this. And these people got together and said, well, there isn't enough money in the treaty to pay all these debts. It would probably have been in millions or something. So they broke it all down. He doesn't trade here anymore. He doesn't get anything. Or this guy is gone. His heirs can't have anything. And they got it all broken down to the $210,000 that was going to be allotted for the trade, for the just payment of the debts to the traders. This is what they said. Everybody had to take this cut. The Indians were told in council before this was at Traverse des Sioux. Brown wasn't so involved in Mendota, but the Indians were told in open council that this was going to happen and this money should go right to the traders. In other words, paid directly to the traders instead of paying it into your hands and then you have to pay it to the traders. You won't like that anyway. But you get all this other stuff too. I mean, this is not the whole treaty. This is just part of it. And they agreed to this, apparently. Well, they did agree to it. There was no doubt about that. There was a whole investigation done on this thing later on, and there's a book this thick that will tell you what everybody said. But the Indians did sign the paper, and as they signed the treaty, there were a couple of disgruntled traders who didn't get any cut. And they came by a little bit later and started a few rumors and started some Indians to say, well, this was unfair and this was wrong. So that's where the big controversy came in. But the payment was made, and apparently everybody else was satisfied with it. It got blown out of hand about 2 years later.
Yeah, again, could set this in context again about, that's the trading paper was,
It's a part of the treaty. Yeah.
That they agreed, well,
which treaty are we talking about?
there's two treaties involved with the Upper Indians and the Lower Indians. And the provision was made, well, there couldn't be a provision in the treaty itself that would say so much is reserved for the traders. That's why you had to have the trader's paper to get all the Indians to sign off on that as a separate agreement. Okay? And that'd be same like signing a contract at the same time as a treaty, but actually you're complying with the wishes of Congress in that you aren't making a specific provision for the traders in the treaty. If you didn't make that kind of provision, then you wouldn't get a treaty.
And you talked about the two separate treaties, the upper
Yeah.
and the lower. Could you specify the tribes that were involved in each of those, and just again summarize
See,
when and where the names of those treaties and when and where they were signed?
Treaty of Traverse de Sioux and the Treaty of Mendota. That's the upper Indians, which are the Sisseton Wahpetons. One of their centers would be Traverse de Sioux, and they would villages. They go up to Big Stone Lake, and some of them were actually villages in what's now Dakota. The lower Indians would be, say, from somewhere north of Shakopee down south.
All the way down the Mississippi.
All the way down
yeah.
the Mississippi. Wabasha and Red Wing would be a couple of them. And two groups, and the past treaties and the later ones are always made with one group or the other. You recognize that you had to deal with them separately. You'd like to get pretty much the same terms in the treaty, of course, except for perhaps the money that was involved. That might be different, a different figure.
So, from the signing of the treaty, 1851 to 58, when Minnesota became a state, could we just have a little review again of what all Joseph R. Brown was up to in that period?
He was very much involved in the legislature all through that period. Always there. He was a clerk of the council in the first legislature, elected several times. Somebody once said that if you wanted to get something done in the legislature, you should talk to somebody who knows something about it, such as Joseph R. Brown, and he knew about legislatures because he used to have one of his own. Pretty well regarded as the man to go to if you wanted to get something done in the legislature.
But he was a bill writer, which you pointed out before. He was also, at that point, a newspaper man. He was the public printer, and he operated the Pioneer and then the Pioneer and Democrat for several years. Then he founded his own newspaper down in Henderson. He was still a public printer, and he could print at any newspaper he wanted to, of course. So he was, these were Democratic organs, as they called them, working for the party. There were plenty of other ones. The Whig organs tended to call him Joe the Juggler, which I guess was a term of approbation in those days, but it was, it sort of kind of says what he was. He was the juggler. You wanted it done, he got it done. While he was in the legislature, he was founding Henderson, and that was going to be, I think Martin McLeod said it, if Paris is France, Henderson is going to be Minnesota. It's going to be the center of all radiating roads, railroads, anything that goes through the state will have to go through Henderson. And he did, I think, have 9 road bills come through those 2 legislatures he was in. So he was very busy with that. He was busy with railroads too, but they didn't come to the state and or into the territory. And
Yeah, you didn't have any real railroad building in the state, built railroads in the state
Yeah.
until about 1870.
yeah, they were coming to the Mississippi, but in 1857 there was a big depression, and everybody could see there weren't going to be any railroads built in Minnesota. You know, in the near future. In fact, probably nothing else. No major federal roads or anything either, because everything was very depressed in those days. So, probably another good reason to take on that Indian agent job. That is a federal pay. You know.
Yeah, and you know, we're getting to the subject of Henderson here now, and you know, just like Dakota/Stillwater here, you know, wasn't he the driving force behind the establishment of Henderson? And you know,
Well, he picked out, yeah, he picked out the place where it was going to be, and then he owned the town site, and was the man who sold every lot in town, or gave it away to somebody who wanted to settle there. The idea, as far as one can determine it, unless there's something deeply mysterious about it, is that Henderson would be a convenient spot on the river to break your river transportation, the river beyond that being somewhat reliable, that is dry in season,
Yeah.
and going overland to your best destination for freights, which would be Fort Ridgely. It'd be also convenient for anybody who wanted to settle north of there. You're putting together, the river is sort of the backbone of the transportation system, and you go from there with heavy freights, with mail routes, stagecoach lines, taking care of the local settlers and build out the system, but until the railroads come through, you'll never get very far away from the backbone, from the rivers.
and yet the river was a challenge for, you know, you'd think, well, just keep going all the way up the river, but you know, that wasn't.
You'd get up to get a steamboat up to the fort, say once or twice a year.
Some years, not every year.
Some years.
Some years they couldn't get to Mankato. Joe really considered Henderson to be the head of navigation, I think. There's really no way you're going to reliably get past that. And he owned a steamboat and other smaller boats, so he could ferry goods. He also, by the time he was founding Henderson in 1852, he also had government contracts for the new fort they were building out there. So he would be the guy who was going to supply the pork and the flour and whatever that was going out there, and to the Indian agencies that were then being built on the other side of the river. So he was going to supply that. And one of the first roads, I believe, in the territory was the Fort Ridgely Road, which was somewhat improved, basically by him and the citizens of Henderson, who were very involved in being able to get this. They were all, everybody in Henderson in those days was a freighter, I think. That's what they did. That was their business, was hauling with oxen.
And one of the exhibits at the center is the facsimile or replica of the land office, and I think Joe played a role in the land office being in Henderson. What exactly was the land office?
Good question.
Yeah, it's one of these things that makes the 1850s, the pre-Civil War area, very much like a foreign country, because they did things differently back then. But the land office would be in charge of transferring title from the government to a settler. Settler is a man who's got 4 sticks, and he goes out in the country that's not claimed or not sold, pounds in a stick, paces off a mile, and that's his farm, builds a lean-to, and digs up a vegetable garden. Now you're a settler and you have a legal claim. You don't own it, but you can defend your claim in court from somebody who's trespassing on it. Claim jumpers, in other words. And when the time comes, the land office has got the register and the receiver, 2 political appointees, and they live off the commissions. And all the people who have got in beyond the surveys and pounded their sticks in the ground, when the government actually comes out and surveys it, because the government can't sell anything until they can say, well, we found it on a map, and this is range and township, and we can pound in a corner and run a survey and say, here's exactly what you own, despite where you put your sticks. So when that happens, you have a chance to come in and fill out an affidavit at the land office saying, yeah, I've been out here and this is my claim, and my neighbors all say I've actually been here, and I say the same thing about them. And they say, very well, and that will be $1.25 an acre. Now, part of the system for getting the country settled is that you don't have to have any money to go out there when you first put your sticks in the unsurveyed land, because nobody's going to collect from you until sometime after the survey comes through. So if you're reasonably astute, you can, and hardworking, you can probably accumulate, say, the $200 you'll need to buy 160 acres at some time in the future. For the settlers, the earlier ones down around the Stillwater area, a lot of them had 8 years. Well, you can, that's not much per year, even if you're not particularly prosperous. So it was, that was doable.
Yeah, and I understand that the office was originally, what, in Red Wing? And
Oh, the original offices were placed, how many were there? I've forgotten now, probably 8 throughout the entire state. Placed where the settlers were coming in on the Mississippi. And so Red Wing was it. By the time Brown was laying out Henderson and owning the whole town site, he was able to file it, I believe, in 1858. And he went to Red Wing to file that town site and get that started. By that time, there were so many settlers that they were dividing up the land offices. They had to have more land offices. So in 1858, the land office was now put in Henderson. It's a little further west. It keeps moving west, of course, as the land is...
57, I think.
57, yeah. As the land is surveyed, the land offices move west. Actually, I think the first land offices for people that were buying here in Stillwater were actually in Wisconsin. No need yet, but very soon it was moved to Stillwater, and very soon after that on into other parts of the state. So
it's good to keep in mind the transportation problem of a farmer out there someplace who has to get into this office with his money in his farm wagon. And if you're talking 20-some miles a day, that's, or a little better, that's a pretty good day. So if you're going...
Back and forth, yes, 10 miles. Max.
Going, say, 60 miles one way to get the Red Wing land office, you're going to be off the farm for a week, and the weeds would be growing pretty high, and the stock will be needing feeding.
So, and then you're just mentioning that, you know, in those early days, everybody in Henderson was a freighter, but Joe Brown really started about that time to concentrate on various forms of transportation, whether it was the, you know, building the roads or things for river travel. And I know, you know, in looking at the document that you prepared for us, you know, you chose, you know, transportation as a focus. So could you, you know, speak again a little bit about how he made that a primary activity, starting around 1858, and
Well,
all the different things that he did?
It actually started around 1830. One of his early transportation feats was running a oxen cart through from Prairie du Chien up to his little site at Oliver's Grove, which is now Hastings. He brought the first cart through by land. And of course, one of the reasons for that is because the military was actually watching the river, and that cart had whiskey in it. Okay, that people would think up things like that to do. So he was always understood that you had to have transportation. Every other industry, every business out on the frontier required transportation. The whole lumber industry was about how do we get the stuff out to the lumber camps, how do we get the logs back? And that exercised a lot of people for a long time, and Brown also. He was a lumberman, so he realized when he paid somebody there in 1849 to take his goods and his people up, way up on the Mississippi, where he was cutting timber, that was very expensive. And the next year, he said, I'll do it myself. And he got his own carts and oxen, leased a lot of the oxen, I guess, and did his own transportation, much cheaper. Okay, so that's where you end up thinking, this is what I have to do in any business I'm in. I have to control the transportation. And I think other people had the same notion, of course. All these people moving out to the Oregon Trail, which didn't go through Minnesota. And that was sort of an oversight on someone's part, too. So Mr. William Nobles was a man who early went on to say that he was going to run a route from Minnesota, from St. Paul, and it was going to go all the way out to the Colorado gold fields. Of course, it would cross the Oregon Trail, too, so if you wanted to go Oregon, that's fine. He got plenty of government funding, and some from Joe, who was also very interested in this thing. But that was, you know, an early federal, of course, this would be a territory, be a federal road, so somebody else gets to pay for it, is the meaning of territorial. The federal government, too, by the way, this is off the subject, but the federal government that was not taking taxes from your neighbor and yourself. The federal government was selling land. So if you somehow managed to winkle money out of the federal government, you weren't hurting anyone. You were merely hooking for Uncle Sam. You were getting the money from tariffs and from land sales. So they can afford it. So it was quite an industry, I think, at one point, is see how much, you know, federal money you could acquire through contracts, through mail routes, through government roads that were going to be, of course, surveyed, and everything would be done by the government. Send the people out to survey the road. They could also survey, you know, your backyard too, if it came to that, and some of them did.
And he had a particular interest in the power of steam.
Oh my!
You know, for river and overland transportation.
Well, working with oxen, I understand they had to triple team them getting them out of Henderson because the hill was so high. And they're very slow and they're very expensive. You may not think they're expensive, but they eat all the grass in sight, and then you have to start hauling hay along. And the teams were usually sold when they got wherever they were going with them, you know, out to Colorado or wherever. And the men would come back and get some more oxen and start over again. And Joe conceived the notion that a steam engine, a locomotive in other words, that could run on land, would be much cheaper in the long run than all these oxen. You didn't have to feed them. You had to find wood and water for it. But it could haul 3-4 cart wagons, you know. So that was his next plan, was to acquire a steam engine. And he did this while he was Indian agent. I believe it went through the books as a sawmill, but it was to work. It was to work for the agency. In other words, he positioned it as a machine that could haul all the Indian goods out there. So it was more reliable than oxen, obviously. So.
It must have been quite the novelty. You know, were there other steam wagons? Or?
Yeah, the fellow who constructed the steam wagon for Joe, John Reed, had a big machine shop in New York and was also an inventor, invented a type of steam engine that was used on Joe Brown's steam wagons, but John had used those engines on a fire engine, which was self-propelled, and made a journey from New York to Philadelphia and back. And John was also in correspondence with some Englishmen who had, well, they had better roads. You know, you do have to have something outside of a mud hole for any kind of a self-propelled machine. But they had better roads, and they had, for years, been building and projecting at least various kinds of steam-powered transportation to run on the common roads in England. So it was nothing brand new, and you had one that was running around New York that was apparently perfectly capable of traveling considerable distances. And it was ideas of a lot of other people had it, but Mr. Brown's was, thanks to Mr. Reed, by the way. Joe was not an inventor or a mechanic, but thanks to Mr. Reed, it turned out to be quite a practical machine. If you look at some later samples of similar machines, there's a numerous number of them that were running, hauling, especially lumber, different wagons of lumber or construction materials or what have you that were commercially available and quite successful. So it's not a wild dream by any means. A little bit ahead of his time, though.
Yeah. So and how did it work out? He brought it to Henderson. What happened?
They set out for Fort Ridgely, and they almost made it there. There's a creek with a fairly steep valley not that far from the fort, and somebody ill-advisedly, I think, decided they would try to go down the embankment and come out the other side, and they didn't.
They went down and not up?
Well, there were no railroad cranes in those days, so there was nothing big enough in the territory that could get it out of there without dismantling it, which is what they eventually did. But it wasn't really their fault. It had taken so long that they'd gotten into a very early snowstorm too, and it was wet, and it was, you know, the kind of early snow you'd get. So they did have their problems there with trying to run the thing through the mud. it worked up to that point. The second one he had built worked all over the place until they actually put a wagon to it and started out, and that was in Nebraska City. By that time, they decided that, and Brown had decided, that it was not going to be practical to run it out of Minnesota anymore. All of the traffic and all of the Pacific Railroad, all were going to go through Nebraska. So we'll put it here, and of course the railroad would follow this route. We got the route, and we've got all the stops on it. Those are going to be the towns on the railroad, and so forth. So, and all the settlers will funnel down this hole. So that makes a lot of sense to do this. It ran all over town, but when it got time to actually haul it out of town, it only made it a few miles, and it broke a crank. A steam engine being the kind of thing, unlike your car, that would stall, it will not stall. It will just break whatever all the pressure's on, and they now realize that, but it was going to work very well, it seemed, but when Brown went back to New York to get the crank and get the mechanics to come and fix it, just at that point, the Indian War blew up. His family was taken prisoner. When he got back to Nebraska, he found that out, and he only got back to La Crosse. He sent the crank on. He quickly came to Minnesota to see what he could rescue his family, and from that point on, that was the priority. The steam wagon was allowed to rust down in Nebraska City, and he didn't get around to it again until 1869, when he had another great scheme and another one built, but unfortunately he died in 1870, and it was ready to ship, but he was unable to handle that. So, and his family was too.
Well, he mentioned, that the Dakota War broke out and he rushed back here. Could you speak a little bit to, his involvement, at the beginning and then in the aftermath of the Dakota War? What role did Joe play in all of that?
I knew that was going to happen. I was trying to figure out what they did with that telephone. It'll
ring for a bit.
Yeah, because there's usually one up here, and I don't see it. So
anybody need a drink of water? Or?
No, we're fine. Okay, it answered itself.
Okay, good. So the Dakota War broke out.
The Dakota War broke out. Joe did hurry back. He joined up with Sibley, who was about to get a command together. Men were being recruited for the Civil War, but there were still several militias that were just being organized into regiments here in Minnesota. So there were men available. They were not trained soldiers, obviously. These were people who were just signed up to go to the Civil War, but they were assigned then to take on the Indian War instead. So he did join up with Sibley. He was made a major. The first thing to do was to go out there and bury the bodies. There were 500 or some settlers scattered around out there, and the crops and their animals and all dead. So Joe was in charge of a burial party that got itself somewhat surrounded up there at what they call Birch Coulee. There were some army men with him, but it was not a very big detail, and there were quite a few Indians. He got himself shot there, but not so seriously that he couldn't go on. They were rescued by Sibley, and Joe then became what he called aide-de-camp. He never got paid for it, but that's what I was doing. I was aide-de-camp for Sibley, and went to the Battle of Wood Lake, to other battles, to Camp Release, where he got his family out and sent them back to Henderson with his oldest son. So after that, Joe was pretty well stuck with the military. He went on 3 expeditions out into the Dakotas. The first one from Camp Release to see if they could get some of the hostiles to surround them or have them come in, and the other ones to kind of chase the Indians away, as it were, keep them away from Minnesota. That was what they all said. So At that point, they were building another line of forts out there. He spent what? He spent about a year at Fort Abercrombie in North Dakota, and then he helped build Fort Wadsworth, now Fort Sisseton in South Dakota, and was in charge of the Indian scouting group. There were about 60 Indians, half-breeds, and some white men that were involved in being in little outlier positions and making sure that no war parties were coming down the Missouri River or something like that.
Part of this seems to have been an effort to kind of salvage something for his wife's Indian relatives and some of his Indian friends who otherwise would look pretty likely to be pushed out beyond the Missouri forever, or out in the Rocky Mountains if somebody found anything worthwhile in the land they've been pushed to.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a matter of rehabilitating some of the people who are regarded by pretty much everybody in Minnesota as every one of them is all in the same classification of wicked savages, which of course was not the case.
Yeah, I could have picked it up.
Somebody's trying to get a hold of you guys, maybe.
Yeah, well, I don't know.
And didn't he play a role in the detention of the Indians who were being held in Mankato at the end of the war?
Oh, no, that was part of his duties as the major, yes. For the winter of 1862-3, the Indian prisoners were held at Mankato, and he was in charge, superintendent of the prison. There was a military force with him standing as provost of the town, and he was in charge of the execution, as it turned out, of the 38 Indians. That is, he beat the drum. Somebody else dropped the trap. So he's always been looked upon by certain people as being the bad guy in this scenario, but this scenario was going to take place. Didn't really matter who. And as it turned out, only 38 were executed. There had been some 300 and some formerly slated for this, so it wasn't as bad as it could have been as far as those Indians were concerned. But the Indians who had not been involved, they had all been sent to Fort Snelling, or the women, children, old men had been. The warriors and many of the groups of Sisseton and Wahpeton were out in Canada, were in North Dakota, were hiding, were afraid to come in. Joe was made a peace commissioner in 1863 with Father Andre from Pembina to go out there and find these people, convince them the U.S. government wasn't going to hurt them, and have them come in and have another reservation for them, which he finally did get. But at least some of those people were made whole, I guess you'd say. They did get their annuities back. They got a reservation in South Dakota where they could farm. They weren't going to be chasing buffalo anymore, but they all knew that. And they had not been anyway that much. They were very much committed to becoming farmers and having their own land.
And Joe kind of played a role in, or at least, he was an advocate for
very
assimilation, or whatever term you might
Well, you know about that. He just
Well, he wrote a series of articles in the Pioneer when he was editor in 1856, and he said, well, there's no reason why we should uproot the Indians from their ancestral homes or the place they're residing now and ship them off a few hundred miles, and then after that another 100, and you all wind up at the Rocky Mountains, which is as far as you're going to go, and get the West Coast Indians who will be sent to the other side of the Rocky Mountains, and then you'll be done with it. But he said, just a matter of giving the Indian a piece of his own land, which he can farm, which is what everybody else in the territory or in the state is actually doing. 95% of the population is farming. Do that, and then there's no reason why they can't stay right there, and they'll just take up enough land for each of them to have a decent farm, instead of saying you have to have an unlimited area for hunting. And that was pretty much what he asked to have incorporated in the 1858 treaty. When they got around to that, he was involved to a certain extent in actually writing the treaty, or so the commissioner said at the time in the course of the negotiations with the Indians. And it appears that that was the case. Particularly with the upper Indians. The lower Indians were led or represented by Little Crow, and Little Crow and Joe Brown did not have a very friendly relationship.
Okay, I think we've kind of covered most of the highlights of his life. Maybe we've left something out, but just as a way of summary, this moniker he got, Joe the Juggler, and you've mentioned it was maybe a term of approbation, and his influence in the early days of legislative work or political work. But what strikes me, and you two as well, I'm sure, is just the huge and broad variety of occupations and undertakings that he had. So if you had 1 minute to, somebody came up to you and said, I never heard of Joe Brown, what did he do? And you had 1 minute and you wanted to tell this person all the different things that he did. Do you think you could?
No.
Could you run off a list of maybe in chronological order? He started out as a printer's apprentice and ended up as a steam wagon entrepreneur.
Can you do that?
I would say once he got out here and out of the Army, or maybe after his first few years in the Army, you could call him a promoter and developer, or in other words, a pioneer. Mm-hmm. But he was always interested in what we would call today developing, to get more business, to get more settlement, to get more transportation. And he was maybe 5-10 years ahead of the actual possibility of doing anything substantial in those lines. He had big ideas, but you have to wait for the population, for events to kind of catch up to where you are right now. And did a lot of marking time, and a lot of things. He was not afraid to try something new. Some of them worked just fine, some of them didn't. You can't say that he established a dynasty or that he left a glistening white monument someplace of his accomplishments, or created a institution that carried on his name for years. It's just been recently established. but you'd have to say that in every period of his life, he certainly had a great effect upon upon his neighbors, upon his fellow citizens, upon everybody else in the territory, the Indians, the politicians, the settlers. And of course, you don't get credit for that, you know, because you started out in Wisconsin, spent a good 10 years in Minnesota, and then went off to the Dakotas someplace. And never actually stuck to the same thing all the time, so that people can keep a little track of you and say who you are and where you are. You always seem to be the same old Joe Brown, but doing something else. As what was Earl Goodrich said, he says, an ordinary man will walk through an open gate, but Joseph R. Brown climbs over the wall.
Yeah, he's had that right. I think there were two things too that that really interfered with Brown's ability to get some of his projects done, and one was the Depression of 1857, which it's just like the Depression we just had, you know, in the 2000s. It really put everything at a stop. Everything stopped right there. You just couldn't get money. All the banks were bankrupt. Settlers actually stopped coming for a while because there was just nothing, no way to absorb them.
Yeah, for money, there was no money in the state.
No, yeah. Everything went back to barter, you know. Actual coins, nobody ever saw those anyway. I guess that's why the Indians really wanted coins they could hold in their hand, because it would be very ephemeral. They would be gone soon. But the other thing that really upset it all was the Dakota War. And at that point, Brown just made a left turn and he had something else to do. It just, everything else had to drop while he did it. It was not impossible for him, when he was out on those trips, to have a sutler's wagon with him, just in case somebody needed to buy something. And bad whiskey was the main thing that they carried along for the soldiers to buy. But that's the way it is with soldiers.
A lot of other people too, I suppose.
He would keep a little business going on the side, no matter what he was doing. But yeah, that took all of his energy right there.
Well,
I'll stop you guys right there.
okay, do you need to do something?
I was gonna swap out the battery.
Okay.
I've got a few minutes if you wanna.
I do have, yeah, if you could do, I just had actually maybe one more question, and I was going to, I ran across a quote from his funeral, and, you know, I'm sure you've had, you know, conversations with other historians about his influence and his visibility or lack thereof, and it's, no man stands forth more prominently as the untiring friend of Minnesota in all the phases of her existence than does Major Brown. So, you know, again, with short battery life in mind, if you could speak overall about the impact that he had on Minnesota history. How would you summarize it?
Well, one of the old settlers in Minnesota, when they were preparing a recommendation of him as candidate for the last territorial governor, said that Joseph R. Brown could well be called the father of Minnesota. And a lot to be said that he had a lot to do with the first local government in Minnesota. He was the first elected representative from what is now Minnesota. He had a lot to do with setting up the original territory. Some people claim that he suggested the very name of Minnesota. He was, throughout the whole territorial period, probably the best known man in Minnesota. When the time came to have a state, he helped write the Constitution. He was in the last territorial legislature that apportioned some of the loaves and fishes in those days. He was Henry Sibley's campaign manager for the first election for governor, and he was on the commission that went over the election returns and determined that Henry Sibley was actually elected the first state governor. He was the assimilationist in dealing with the Indians, the one that believed the Indian didn't have to be pushed on forever and ever, that there was a home for him here in Minnesota. I would think that would about summarize it.
You got any more time on the battery?
Yeah, go ahead.
You want to try it? Your take on that same question?
Well, you know, one of the other things at the time of his death, a person said, this is the man who's been the oldest settler. He's been in this territory the longest. He came here, and 50 years he's been right here. And of course the rest of us are pretty much, you know, Johnny come lately. So they looked upon him as that father figure, I think, the man who you'd go to find out what had happened in the other days. He was, as Bob said, the best known person in the territory. Everybody knew who Old Joe Brown was. The newspapers would just have to say, the juggler's in town, and everybody knew who it was. You know. But, he was did not mention the founder of so many town sites. His original town on Great Cloud Island, that fell to the 1857 Depression, but he had a Great Cloud City all ready to go, several buildings. He, of course, had started Dakota. He moved into St. Paul for a while, but while he was doing that, he was founding Henderson, later on Browns Valley, which is where he ended up, where his family ended up after he had left Fort Wadsworth. At Fort Wadsworth, he was again in the transportation business. I guess we didn't mention that, but he was now running supplies from Browns Valley to Fort Wadsworth. Whatever you could do, I guess, with freighting, he would do. So he had, I think, about as much influence on how Minnesota came out as any person did. The fact that he isn't well known is possibly due to the fact he never held high office. He's not a governor or a senator or something. And he is, I don't know what I was going to say.
I think we got it.
Lost the track.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We covered the tracks.
Yeah. There's more
know.
tracks, but
So,
yeah.
you know.
You're going to get this down to 3 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Okay. No
I'm
problem.
not sure how, but we will.
No problem.
But we will. Thank you, Jeff.
Oh.